Now, for more on the war in Ukraine and NATO's role, we're joined by the chair of NATO's military committee, Admiral Rob Bauer. He's speaking to us from the Milken Global Conference in LA. Admiral, thank you for your time this morning. As NATO's most senior military officer, what's your assessment of where things stand in Ukraine? We understand a major counteroffensive is imminent.
Steve, Julie, good morning to you. I think both sides have similar problems in terms of we're in the 15th month of a 4-day war. That was what Mr. Putin said at the beginning. And basically, after a lot of battles and a lot of time, both sides now are looking for new personnel, new weapon systems, and more ammunition. And that is what is ongoing. And the result most likely will be that the Russians will have to focus, not by choice, but by necessity, for quantity, which means a lot of not so well-trained conscripts or mobilized people, and they will have to use older material from stock. We're talking, for example, about the T-54 tank. The 54 stands for the year when the tank was designed, 1954. The Ukrainians will most likely focus on quality, using Western weapon systems and the Western training that is being provided on both the weapon systems and on the larger units that are using those weapon systems combined.
Admiral, with neither Russia nor Ukraine close to achieving its stated war aims for now, any firm indications currently as to how long we should expect this conflict to go on? And how do you think this war will end? And what will it take to get there?
It will be very difficult to say how the war exactly will end, but for now it is certain that the Russians have not changed their strategic objectives, which is basically not only taking Ukraine, but basically going back to the borders of 1997, which is including most of the nations that are now member of NATO from the north, the 3 Baltic states, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania. That means that it's not only about Ukraine, this war. And so the strategic objectives from of the Russians have not been met at all. And therefore, they will continue to take more of Ukraine. And as a result, Ukraine needs to continue to defend itself and, of course, is going to take back, if possible, as much of what is legally theirs, that is to retake the territory that was taken by the Russians. So I think for the time being, we will not see any appetite to go to the negotiation table, not on the Russian side and not on the Ukrainian side. So it is very difficult to predict how the war exactly will end. But the spring offensive that a lot of people are talking about is, of course, for the Ukrainians to take back what is legally theirs.
Admiral, you've said before that NATO is prepared for a direct confrontation with Russia. What would be the red line that would cause that to happen? And what is being done to both deter it, but also to prepare for it?
Well, I think it is important to understand that since the Ukrainian annexation, the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, in the military, we started thinking about Russia as a threat in NATO. And we developed a new NATO military strategy in 2019. Then from there on, we continued working on a deterrence and defend strategy based on the fact that there's 2 threats, being Russia and the terrorist groups. That work is ongoing, but the result of that work on 24 February 2022 was that NATO was actually more ready than a lot of people expected, for example, by beefing up the number of forces under command of NATO from 4,000 to 40,000. And we surprised Russia by doing that. And I think the Russians are not seeking any confrontation with Russia, and therefore that works. So that deterrence works with regard to the defense of and the deterrence of our own alliance.
And Admiral, here in Asia, China has been trying to play the role of peacemaker in Ukraine. What do you make of Beijing's efforts, and Can they make a positive contribution?
In theory, of course, they can, but it's unclear whether, of course, this is enough for Ukraine. It's a sovereign state that was invaded by Russia, and therefore it is them, Ukraine, that has to decide whether any possible solution other than a complete withdrawal from Russia, of the Russians from Ukraine, is enough. And very recently, polling has shown that 90% or more of the Ukrainians have told their president, continue with the war, despite the destruction, despite the killing, despite the wounded people, despite the deported children, despite a winter without heating, water, and electricity. So for now, the atmosphere and the mood in Ukraine is not about a negotiated settlement. It is about taking back what is theirs.
Admiral, another Asian country that's sort of lent its weight to the events as well is Japan. They've been keen to support Ukraine. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida was in Kyiv a few weeks ago, and he said that Japan will support Ukraine until peace is restored. This conflict stretching far beyond NATO as well.
Yeah, what we see is, of course, we focus on the physical security and defense of our alliance in a region that is spanning Europe and the Arctic and, of course, the Atlantic Ocean. It doesn't mean, though, that if anything happens in that region, that it doesn't have an effect in many different ways in the rest of the world. And so basically what we see is that nations in Asia, like Japan, like South Korea, like Australia, like New Zealand, basically say what happened to Ukraine can also happen to nations in Asia, because there's more autocracies than just Russia. And therefore, because this is about the rules-based international order, because this is about respecting sovereignty and the borders of nations, or not respecting, as we have seen in Ukraine, there is more nations in the world and should be concerned about their own sovereignty. And that is the response from the partners of NATO, which is the Asia-Pacific Four, which is Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. That is why they are concerned. That is why they are talking to NATO. That is why they are partners. That is why the chiefs of defense of those nations are coming once a year to Brussels to meet with their colleagues in the military committee.
Right. And staying in the region, Admiral, experts have pointed to East Asia as potentially the next global flashpoint after Ukraine. What's your view of tensions in Taiwan now, and how does NATO see itself playing a role should China invade Taiwan?
Well, that is primarily a political discussion, Julie, and not a military one, because the alliance is not making any plans to counter China. China is seen by the heads of state and leaders of NATO as a challenge, a strategic challenge. For example, in cyber and in space, we see very unfriendly and sometimes dangerous actions from the Chinese. In other areas, of course, there is not a confrontation between China and NATO. Therefore, NATO is not seeing China as a threat. The alliance as a whole is not seeing China as a threat, is not making military plans against China, as we are doing with Russia. And therefore, it is unlikely that NATO as an alliance in military way is becoming involved in the conflict, if there would be a conflict between China and Taiwan. Of course, there can be NATO allies involved in that, but that is different from the alliance as a whole.
Admiral, just one last question for you, and we'll bring it back to events happening in Ukraine with this counteroffensive that is imminent. What should we be looking out for when it begins that will sort of tell us which way the conflict is sort of headed?
Well, first and foremost, it is up to the government of Ukraine when they are ready for a counteroffensive. And then when they're ready, they will decide when, of course, they will start it. And there are several factors that will influence that. It is, of course, the materiel state of for the counteroffensive that should be good enough. It is the training of their forces. It is the supplies, not so that you not only can start an offensive, but can continue with it for a certain period of time. And then, of course, there's things like weather that plays a role in when you start with that. If it is about, which is likely about retaking a territory that is now being taken by Russia, we will see an attack on some point along the front, or multiple attacks. It depends on their choice, and of course we will see a response from the Russian forces, and it will be a serious fight because the Russians have been digging in along that front, and therefore it won't be easy. And we're talking about 350,000 Russian forces in the occupied territories of Ukraine. So if anyone thinks that will be an easy fight to retake what is legally, of course, part of Ukraine, is not a fact. It will be a tough fight. It will be hopefully, of course, successful for the Ukrainians, and the amount of success will determine, of course, any willingness on the side of the Russians to stop the war. Because people have to understand, if Russia stops this war now, then the war is over. If Ukraine stops the war now, they've lost their country.
Admiral, thank you very much for your insight this morning and for speaking with us. Admiral Rob Bauer, Chair of NATO's Military Committee.